He wasn't supposed to survive. A battered German shepherd limping across the scorched sands of Arizona, dragging his scarred body toward a fate no one expected. 3 Marines bound and left to die under a sun that showed no mercy. He had no master, no command, just a memory of a man who once saved him. No one saw him coming. No one believed a dog marked as dangerous could choose to protect again. But this isn't a story about vengeance. It's a story about redemption, about a dog who answered to no one, but listened to something greater. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. And if you believe miracles come on 4 legs, hit subscribe. This is the kind of story that lingers in your soul. The wind scraped across the desert like sandpaper, dragging the blistering heat of the mid-morning sun across the skin with cruel precision. The sun, a ruthless sentinel high above the flatlands of southern Arizona, showed no mercy to the broken silhouettes standing beneath it. Just 15 miles outside the dusty edges of Sable Rock, a half-forgotten town cradled by badlands and buttes, the desert swallowed sound and shade alike. There were no roads here, only tire tracks long since buried beneath drifts of rust-red dust. And there, in the middle of this cracked nowhere, 3 men stood bound to split fence posts, arms hoisted by ropes so tightly cinched that their fingers had already turned a sickly shade of blue. Sergeant Boone Keller, 36, was the oldest. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sunburned skin and dark blonde hair now matted against his skull with sweat. He had the air of a man used to carrying other people's weight. His nose had broken once, maybe twice, leaving it slightly off-center, and his jawline was stubbornly square. Boone didn't talk much unless it was necessary. Years of service in the Marines, including deployments in dry, foreign places much like this, had burned away most of his sentiment. But he wasn't cruel, just tired. He had signed on with Waylon Creed to earn a clean wage helping with convoy security. Easy work. Or so it had seemed. Beside him, Corporal Milo Drennan, 29, leaned limply against his post. Milo had once been the fastest runner in his unit. Lean, wiry, the kind of guy who never stopped moving. His mixed heritage showed in his olive-toned skin and dark curled hair. A sarcastic smile usually rested on his face, even when things got bad. But not today. His lips were cracked. Blood traced down his chin from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. He was slipping under. Lance Corporal Remy Chase, 25, the youngest, looked barely out of boot camp. Freckles across his nose, coppery hair stiff from dried sweat, and hazel eyes full of both pain and disbelief. He'd idolized Boone like an older brother, followed orders with a desperate eagerness to belong. Now, his lips moved soundlessly, whispering things to the heat. Standing 10 feet away in a crisp linen shirt, untucked but clean, was Waylon Creed, a man who owned too much land and too many guns. At 52, Waylon looked like a man who'd once been handsome in a cruel way. A jagged scar sliced from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight back in a wilder time, and his eyes were a cold, pale blue, the kind of eyes that never blinked when a man begged. Waylon walked with the leisurely gait of someone who'd already decided what kind of man he was long ago. Tall, thick in the shoulders and stomach alike, with a silver wristwatch gleaming beneath the sun, he looked each man over one final time. "This," he said, voice smooth like whiskey left too long in the sun, "is the price of weakness." He stepped closer to Boone, whose chin was barely lifted, and pulled off the dog tags that hung around the sergeant's neck. "You're not soldiers anymore, you're liabilities." Then, he turned on his heel, kicked up a cloud of dust, and climbed back into his gleaming black Jeep. The engine roared, the tires groaned, and soon, he vanished into the shimmering horizon. Boone's throat rasped, but no words came. Milo slumped. Remy's knees buckled slightly before the ropes caught him mid-collapse. Not far away, half camouflaged by a ridge of sunburnt sandstone, a creature crouched. Eyes the color of storm-dark earth watched it all, unblinking. The wind lifted the fine hairs of his dense fur, revealing patches of old battle scars beneath. His name, though he hadn't heard it in years, was Bruno. Bruno was a German shepherd, larger than most, muscular, with a thick double coat that had faded from deep sable to dust-colored tan. One ear had been notched by a bite long ago, and a faded scar curved down his left flank, a reminder of things humans had done to him. He was 5 years old, middle-aged by canine terms, and he carried the haunted calm of an animal who had once belonged to something bigger than himself. He had once worn a harness that read K9 Unit and rode in helicopters that rattled like tin cans in the wind, but he had also seen blood, too much of it. One day he'd bitten the wrong man in the right situation. After that, they called him dangerous, untrainable, disposable. But Bruno remembered Boone, not by name, but by scent. Boone had pulled him out of the wreckage of a vehicle years ago, dragging him to safety under gunfire. That smell, oil, sweat, and a ghost of pine soap had never left his memory. So now, when Bruno saw Boone sagging under ropes in the middle of the desert, something stirred in the dark reservoir of his instincts. He stood, shaking dust from his fur, and turned his head toward the fading echo of the Jeep's tires. Then, with ears flat and nose twitching, he began the slow, cautious descent toward the dying men. The desert offered no shelter. No birds circled. The sun only rose higher. But now the men were no longer alone. The desert changed after sundown. The searing light faded to bruised purples and smoldering orange, and with it came the cold, sharp, immediate, and without apology. The sands outside Sable Rock cooled fast, sucking the warmth from the rocks and the bodies that still clung to them. No one came through this patch of land at night unless they were desperate, or something more ancient than desperation. Bruno moved low along the wind-scraped ridge, nose close to the sand, tracking the scent of rope, blood, and a distant memory he could not yet name. His paws made no sound on the cooled earth. The breeze had shifted, carrying the stale copper of sweat and the low, ragged exhale of men on the edge of slipping away. When he crested the last dune and saw them again, the three figures sagging against their bindings, the moonlight painting their faces like the final touch of an elegy, he paused. One ear twitched, his tail stiffened. It was not fear that rooted him, but something else, something like betrayal, remembered. Bruno had learned not to trust men. They shouted orders with voices like thunder, then turned cold when he failed to obey the ones that made no sense. He had been trained by fists and broken by commands. The last handler he'd known had left him muzzled in the back of a truck for 2 days before dumping him into the fringe of this desert like spoiled meat. Since then, Bruno had survived on instinct and silence. But Boone's face, what little was visible beneath the grime, stirred something different. It was older than memory, deeper than language. Boone had once pulled him out of fire, out of shattered glass and smoke, cradling his broken leg with gentle hands while bullets cracked overhead. Bruno had never forgotten the smell of that moment. Smoke and blood, yes, but also trust. He crept forward until his breath was almost touching Boone's boot. The sergeant didn't move, but his chest still rose, shallow and strained. Bruno sniffed, then nudged Boone's knee with his nose. When the man let out a weak groan, Bruno sat, still, watching. The other two were worse off. Milo's head hung, eyes fluttering but unfocused. Remy was murmuring something about cold stars and home. Bruno turned his body, curling against Boone's side. His fur pressed against the man's thigh, sharing what warmth he could. The wind howled again, flinging dust and dead grass across the clearing. Bruno pressed in tighter, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. As the night deepened, Bruno licked dew off a patch of stone, then gently brushed his tongue against Boone's cracked lips. The moisture was little, but it coaxed a raspy sigh. Encouraged, Bruno repeated the ritual, gathering drops of desert condensation and delivering them to the three bound men one by one. Hours passed. The stars wheeled silently above. Boone stirred more often now, occasionally whispering nonsense or names Bruno didn't recognize. From time to time, Bruno's gaze drifted toward the east. There was safety that way, he knew. An abandoned barn where he'd holed up during sandstorms. A creek that sometimes trickled even in August. He could leave, go back to his life of shadows and silence. But every time he stood to go, Boone would twitch, or Milo would let out a sob, or Remy would start shivering anew. And so, Bruno stayed. The moon had passed its zenith when the first memory fully overtook him. It was a deployment, Afghanistan maybe, heat like now, but with rot in the air. There had been shouting, gunfire. Boone's voice had cut through the chaos like a line thrown across a chasm. "I got him," Boone had shouted, lifting Bruno's limp, bloody form from the rubble. Then the pain meds, the long flight, the end of the handler, the new cage. Bruno whimpered softly, tail thumping once. Boone's eyelids cracked open. Just a sliver, just enough. "You," he rasped, barely audible. Bruno didn't move. He only blinked, then leaned forward and rested his chin on Boone's thigh. The sound that came next was neither a sob nor a laugh, but something between. Boone's hand tried to rise, failed. Bruno nosed it gently, then shifted, placing his body against all three men in turn, rotating his warmth. As dawn neared, frost kissed the desert shrubs, and light began its slow crawl up the spines of distant mesas. Bruno rose once more, padded to a nearby ridge, and scanned the horizon. Still nothing. Still no one. But he would not leave, not now. He made his choice beneath the stars. These men were his, and he would not fail them. Dawn broke over the desert with a hush, painting the sandstone cliffs in dusty gold and deepening reds. A breeze stirred the brittle mesquite branches outside the high fence that marked the boundary of Cactus Hollow, a working ranch tucked into a forgotten arroyo 30 miles south of Sable Rock. Horses stirred in their pens, heads rising as the first notes of morning filtered through the still air. Bruno stood on the edge of that fence, coated in dust, his breath ragged from the miles he'd run since leaving Boone and the others just before sunrise. His coat was patchy with dirt and cactus burrs. One of his pads bled lightly from a cut, earned crossing a dry wash filled with shale, but his eyes were sharp, unyielding, scanning the homestead beyond. The ranch itself was a rough-spun place, not run down, but lived in. Faded red barns leaned into the sun with the familiarity of long use. A battered windmill creaked overhead. From inside the small ranch house, light flickered as someone struck a match and lit the old propane stove. Silas Grady emerged moments later, mug of coffee in hand, boots unlaced, and a scowl permanently carved into his lean, sun-dried face. He was in his early 50s, tall and wiry, with deep creases etched from years of hard sun and harder choices. A faded tattoo peeked out beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his denim shirt, USMC, flanked by crossed rifles. His left hand trembled slightly as he lifted the mug, the kind of tremor that came not from age, but from things left unspoken. Silas had once led men through deserts like this, half a world away, but his last tour had ended in blood and guilt. His squad ambushed, one man dying in his arms. He'd been delayed by a broken axle, 15 minutes late. It was the sort of failure that burrowed deep and never let go. Bruno barked, a short, urgent sound. Silas froze on the porch. His gaze drifted to the figure by the fence, a German shepherd, lean and wild-eyed, with a coat dulled by sand and time. There was something oddly familiar about the dog. Maybe not the look, but the stance, the intensity. "What the hell?" Silas muttered, stepping off the porch. Bruno paced the fence line, circling tight, then bolted 10 yards down the trail before stopping and looking back. He barked again, tail stiff, ears alert. "Coyotes don't act like that," Silas said aloud, frowning. He approached slowly, hands visible, though his voice stayed low and cautious. "You trying to tell me something, boy?" Bruno turned, trotted another 10 yards, then stopped again. His body was coiled tight with urgency. Silas knelt by the fence, examining the bleeding paw and the old scar along the dog's flank. He saw the notched ear. Something about that ear sparked a flicker of memory. K9 footage, Warzone reports. He reached forward, and Bruno didn't flinch. Instead, he licked the man's wrist once, then stepped away, barking sharply toward the horizon. That was enough. Silas stood, downed the rest of his coffee in a single swig, and turned on his heel. "All right. You want me to follow? You better know where we're going." Inside, he grabbed a battered saddlebag, filled it with a few essentials, water, bandages, a length of rope, a revolver with one speed loader. Then he whistled sharply. From the main pen emerged a paint gelding named Murphy, white and chestnut with a lazy eye and a temperament halfway between loyal and grumpy. Silas had raised him since he was a skittish colt. The horse sniffed Bruno warily but followed Silas without hesitation. Bruno led them fast, darting ahead and then circling back when Murphy's pace slowed. Silas said nothing, just watched and followed, brow furrowed beneath his sweat-stained hat. The terrain grew crueler as they pushed deeper into the backcountry. Cracked shale slopes, thornbrush ravines, dry creek beds with footprints too faint to be recent but not quite gone. They rode for over an hour, silence broken only by wind and hoofbeats. "Where in God's name are we going?" Silas finally asked, wiping grit from his mouth. Bruno paused near a rocky rise, then darted over the top and disappeared. When Silas crested the ridge behind him, the world dropped into sharp focus. There, in the basin below, bound to sun-bleached posts, were three figures. Barely moving, heads slumped, skin blistered red beneath the rising sun. Silas let out a curse that choked halfway up his throat. "Jesus!" He kicked Murphy into a hard gallop down the incline, dust and stones scattering. Bruno raced ahead, barking once, then rushing to Boone's side. He pawed the man's leg gently, nosed at the rope. Silas dismounted hard, boots thudding against the sand. The sight of Boone's face as he lifted it broke something loose inside him. A younger man, marine haircut, dog tags gone. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. "They left you out here." He pulled a folding knife from his belt and began cutting the ropes one by one. Bruno moved quickly to the others, Milo and Remy, sniffing, licking, whining softly. "Easy," Silas murmured. "You brought me here. You did good." Boone groaned as he sagged into Silas's arms, barely conscious. "You're all right," Silas said, voice firmer than he felt. "You're gonna make it." He worked quickly, freeing all three men, then dragged them one by one into the narrow shade cast by the ridge. Bruno lay protectively near Remy, occasionally glancing toward the top of the rise, as if expecting something or someone to return. Silas knelt in the shade, chest heaving, eyes tight with memories. 15 minutes too late, he whispered, not sure if he meant now or 10 years ago. The desert at midday was not merely hot. It was punishing. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves, curling the air like smoke from an invisible fire. Each gust of wind carried biting sand that stung the skin and blurred the path behind. The trail had grown faint, only occasional scuffs in the red dust. A heel mark here, a half-print there. But Silas Grady pressed on with the silent determination of a man who'd once navigated worse. Beside him ran Bruno, his tongue lolling, gait slightly limping from his earlier wound. His fur had gathered new grime and ash-colored grit, and every few steps he turned his head back to ensure Silas still followed. Though he could have moved faster alone, Bruno no longer saw himself that way. What bound him to Boone and the others ran deeper than instinct. It was memory, perhaps even loyalty, formed in fire and smoke. Murphy, the gelding, trudged behind with saddle creaking under Silas. Sweat darkened the cowboy's back and soaked his hatband. His eyes scanned the land with the haunted look of someone who'd missed their chance once before and had no intention of doing so again. Bruno slowed near a slope where the sand had shifted, revealing more definite tracks. Silas dismounted and knelt, brushing his fingers lightly along the indentations. 3 pairs of boots had been dragged, the shuffle marks shallow but clear. He nodded once. "Not long ago," he muttered. Meanwhile, back at the ridge, the 3 Marines were slipping further into the haze of heat and thirst. Boone lay on his side now, barely responsive, lips cracked, and eyes flickering beneath closed lids. Milo mumbled disconnected thoughts, one moment about the sea, the next about a fire at some base camp. Remy wept softly, voice hoarse, muttering prayers to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Their thoughts, fractured by dehydration, became collages of memories and regrets. "I shouldn't have taken that job," Remy rasped, staring at the sun with filmy eyes. "Didn't even ask what was in the truck. Just saw the pay." Boone coughed, barely a sound. Wasn't about the pay. It was about forgetting. "I needed out." Milo turned his head slightly, sand crusting one cheek. "I had nowhere else. No family. Waylon found me drunk behind a mechanic's shop. Gave me a gun and a deadline." Boone managed a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Some recruiter. In that silence that followed, memories bled in like ink on dry paper. There was smoke again. Rubble. A howl from somewhere deep and low, not human. Boone was crouched behind a shattered wall, one leg bleeding badly, his rifle jammed. Screams rang out nearby. A dog, black and tan, streaked with ash, emerged from the smoke, its front leg dragging, eyes wide with terror. Boone didn't think. He just reached out, grabbed the dog by the harness, and pulled him into cover. "You're okay," he had said aloud, to no one in particular, We're both okay. He never saw the dog again after the medevac. Didn't even ask about it. Just another scar left behind. And yet, was it? Boone's eyes opened a fraction. His gaze drifted to the rise where Bruno had disappeared hours before. Was it you? He whispered. Back on the trail, Bruno picked up the pace again. He barked once, sharp and clear, and Silas mounted quickly. You smell something? You see something? They crested a bluff, the wind hitting harder now, carrying the scent of sweat, rope, and desperation. Below them, barely visible among scrub and stone, were the posts. And the men. Bruno let out a low whine and bolted forward. Silas kicked Murphy into a canter, jaw clenched. By the time they reached the site, Boone had stopped mumbling. Milo was unconscious. Remy stirred weakly as Bruno approached, licking at his face. Silas leapt from the saddle, grabbing the canteen from Murphy's flank. He lifted Boone's head and poured a slow trickle into his mouth. Boone coughed violently, but swallowed. You ain't dying today, Silas said firmly. He worked down the line, offering each of them water, wiping dust from eyes, cutting the bonds that had begun to scar wrists. Bruno sat between Milo and Boone, pressing against them both, a silent reassurance that they were not alone. Thought I lost him, Silas whispered, hands trembling. Thought I was too late. Again. Bruno met his eyes. For a second, just a heartbeat, Silas could have sworn the dog nodded. The sun hung low over the jagged edge of the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the desert basin. The sky burned with the colors of dying light, orange bleeding into rose, fading into purple. Silas Grady crouched beside the three men he'd pulled from death's grip just hours earlier, their bodies still, breath shallow, like candles in the final flicker before the flame. Boone Keller stirred first. His lips cracked as he whispered hoarsely, eyes fluttering open to a dusky sky. He blinked hard, his vision fuzzy, but the silhouette beside him was unmistakable. Pointed ears, broad shoulders, and that familiar deep brown coat. Bruno, mela that sow? Bruno whimpered softly, his body pressed against Boone's side. He licked the Marine's cheek with a slow, reverent swipe, then lay still, nose against Boone's neck, as if monitoring his heartbeat. Boone reached a trembling hand to rest on the dog's scruff. It shook with effort, but the touch was gentle. Bruno stayed there, unmoving, like a silent vow. Milo Drennan stirred next, groaning as the pain in his limbs caught up with him. He turned his head, coughing dryly. Remy Chase was the last to move, barely. His body was curled inward, eyes open but vacant, like he hadn't quite come back from wherever his mind had taken him. Silas stood over them, wiping his brow. He pulled a small field radio from his saddlebag, its casing dented but still functional. With calloused fingers, he tuned to a local channel and pressed the mic. Nora, it's Silas. I need you, sis. 3 men, dehydrated, sunburned, half dead. Near the edge of Buffalo Wash. Bring saline, antibiotics, anything you got. There was a pause before the crackled reply came. I'm on my way. 30 minutes. Nora Grady, Silas's younger sister, was a trauma nurse in the nearby town of Tamerlan. In her late 30s, tall and spare, with sharp cheekbones and a no-nonsense voice, she had inherited their mother's calm under fire and their father's mule-headed grit. Life had weathered her face, but sharpened her instincts. After losing her husband in a ranch accident 3 years ago, she threw herself fully into her work and family, often the first to arrive at an emergency and the last to leave. Silas lowered the radio, then crouched beside Boone again. Help's coming, just hang on. Boone rasped. He found you? Bruno, I thought I was hallucinating. No hallucination, Silas said. He ran all the way to my place, nearly tore his foot open. Smart son of a gun. Boone closed his eyes, lips twitching into a ghost of a smile. I saw him. Once, years back. Pulled him from a fire. Didn't know if he made it. Silas looked toward Bruno, who was now stretched between Milo and Remy, tail thumping gently as he watched both with soft eyes. Maybe he remembered, Silas said quietly. Maybe he never forgot. Minutes passed, thick with silence and the whisper of wind through dry brush. The heat was fading, but the exhaustion was bone deep. Silas gathered brush to build a small barrier against the evening chill. He poured what remained of his canteen into a metal bowl, placing it gently by Bruno, who nudged it toward Remy with his snout. Half an hour later, a pickup truck kicked up a dust trail on the horizon. Silas stood, waving once. The truck rolled to a stop near the slope, and Nora jumped out, already in motion. She carried a canvas medical bag slung over her shoulder and a determined set to her jaw. Her dark auburn hair was tied in a loose braid, her scrub top stained from an earlier shift. "Told you if you ever called me out here, it better be life or death," she said briskly. "It is." She didn't argue. Dropping to her knees, she assessed the men in silence. Her hands were quick and practiced, checking pulses, cleaning wounds, preparing IV lines. "These boys are lucky. Another hour out here and they'd be gone." "They're Marines," Silas muttered. "They don't quit easy." "Marines or not, heat stroke's heat stroke. Hand me that roll of gauze." Silas obeyed. Bruno watched, alert, tail flicking gently as Nora worked. She paused only once, meeting the dog's gaze. "Is this the one you mentioned? The war dog?" "Yeah," Silas said. "The one with the scar." Nora looked him over, then nodded. "I've treated worse patients with less soul in their eyes." As night deepened and stars began to pierce the sky, Nora finished dressing wounds and set up portable IV bags from a metal stand fashioned from her truck's toolbox handle. The three men, though weak, were beginning to stabilize. Boone turned his head slowly towards Silas, voice gravel. "Why'd you come?" Silas didn't answer right away. He sat beside him, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "Because once," Silas said finally, "I didn't. Man died because I was late, because I made a choice. You don't forget that kind of thing." Boone nodded slowly. "No, you don't." They sat like that a while, 4 men and a dog under the darkening sky, breathing the same hard air, bound by war, by pain, by chance. Bruno rested his head on Remy's chest, listening to the beat that moments ago had nearly faded. 3 heartbeats, still here, still fighting. By morning, the desert had quieted. A cold breeze slipped through the sleeping brush as dawn crept across the sand, stretching pale fingers of light toward the small clearing where Silas's tent flapped quietly beside the wounded men. The air was cooler now, but the sense of urgency remained, the kind that came after survival, when clarity returned and hard decisions had to be made. Milo Drennan sat up first. His body ached, lips still dry despite the IV Nora had hung the night before. But his mind was clearer than it had been in days. He looked toward Boone and Remy, still resting, and then to Nora Grady, who stood a few feet away packing up her medical kit. Her braid hung loose over one shoulder, and her eyes were lined with exhaustion. But they were alert, measuring, steady, kind. "I kept something," Milo said quietly. Nora turned. "What?" He reached toward his boot, pulling aside a double-stitched seam. With slow fingers, he withdrew a small, battered field notebook, wrapped in a strip of cloth, darkened by sweat and dust. He looked at it for a moment before holding it out to Silas and Nora. "It's all in here. Every transaction, every drop point, every man Wayland's paid off or made disappear. I wrote it down before we got caught. Thought if we didn't make it out, maybe someone else would find it." Silas took the notebook, flipping it open with care. The pages were dense with blocky handwriting. Dates, times, initials, locations. Nora stepped closer and peered over his shoulder. This is everything," she whispered. "He listed the names?" "Some," Milo said. "Others just codes. But I remember most of the faces. A few were civilians, folks who asked questions or said no to something they shouldn't have." Boone sat up now, frowning. "We were never supposed to know the whole picture, but Milo did. He saw more than any of us. That ledger, it's dangerous." Nora thumbed through the pages slowly. Then she froze. "Here," she said, her voice low. She turned the notebook around and pointed at a name scrawled in the margin of one page. Karen Dupre. Boone raised an eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" Nora swallowed hard. "More than that. She was my roommate back in nursing school. We both came out here around the same time. She took a job at one of the ranch hospitals, quit after 2 months, said something was wrong with the way the hands were being treated. Then she vanished. No note, no trace." Milo leaned forward, face drawn. "She came to Wayland's ranch. I saw her, once, in the back of a transport truck. She looked scared, and then she was gone." Nora stared at the name for a moment longer, then closed the book with trembling hands. We can't take this to local law enforcement, Boone said, voice dry but firm. Wayland has half the sheriff's office in his pocket. I know, Silas added, jaw tight. That's why this doesn't go through normal channels. So what then? Remy murmured, finally awake and sitting up with difficulty. What do we do? March up to his gate and wave it in his face? No, Boone said, shaking his head. We wait. We gather. We plan. Bruno, who had been lying beside Boone with his head tucked under his paw, lifted his ears. He rose to his feet, sniffed the air, and padded over to Silas, nudging his hand. Even the dog agrees, Silas muttered. Remy chuckled weakly. Nora looked at each of them in turn. You're talking about going against a man with money, manpower, and no conscience. Are you sure? Boone met her eyes. We've all seen what he's capable of, and I think we've all had enough. She considered this for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, but we do this smart. I have contacts, trauma nurses, EMTs, a few field doctors who've seen shady stuff but been too scared to talk. If I bring this to them quietly, they'll listen. Silas handed the notebook back to Milo. Keep it on you. For now, it stays with the man who paid for it in blood. Outside the clearing, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the dry scent of creosote and something else, something colder. The sun dipped low behind the buttes of Sable Rock, casting long shadows across the dust-beaten path leading to the old mission chapel. Once a place of prayer and quiet, it now stood as a relic. Adobe walls cracked by time, the wooden cross on the roof slanted like a forgotten promise. But tonight, light flickered behind the dusty windows. Not from candles, but from lanterns, the kind carried by people who had spent most of their lives in the dark. Inside, the scent of worn denim, sweat, and sun-baked earth filled the air. Silas Grady stood near the pulpit, his worn hat held against his chest. Beside him sat Boone, Milo, and Remy, each still bruised and bandaged but upright, their military presence quiet but commanding. Nora paced near the back, checking on a cooler of bottled water and a first aid box, occasionally casting a protective glance toward Bruno, who rested near the entrance, ears up, eyes scanning every soul who stepped inside. They came in small groups, laborers from ranches, workers from canneries, a few families with dusty shoes and lined faces. Most of them knew each other by trade, if not by name. Their expressions were wary, a mix of skepticism and exhaustion, and fear, old fear, buried deep. The first to speak was Javier Rojo, a wiry man in his 50s with a tan face and silver threading his black hair. His hands bore the calluses of 30 years wrangling cattle and fixing engines. He stood stiffly, arms crossed, eyes on Milo. You're the ones Wayland had beaten. Milo nodded. We were hired to protect his shipments, but what we found was something else. People working in the heat for no pay, beaten, disappeared. We tried to stop it. We failed. Boone took over. But we didn't come here tonight to ask for sympathy. We came to give you truth. He held up the field notebook, the ledger, the pages dog-eared, stained, but full of names. He set it on a table for anyone to see. A hush fell. Then, slowly people moved forward, drawn like moths to fire. Names were read aloud. Some whispered, some shouted. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs became outrage. I thought he moved to Texas. No, he disappeared last June. That's my cousin's signature. He was working Wayland's North Paddock. As the ledger passed from hand to hand, Bruno began moving through the chapel. His presence was unspoken reassurance. He padded up to the elderly, to the children, to men whose hands trembled slightly. One by one, he touched them. A paw on a boot, a gentle nudge. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Then came Lucia, a girl no older than 7. Her dress was faded pink with a torn hem, her boots mismatched and too big. She walked up shyly and knelt beside Bruno. He didn't move, just let her stroke the thick fur along his scarred ear. He doesn't talk, she whispered, but his heart's real big, I can tell. Her father, Luis Navarro, a ranch worker with quiet eyes and a limp, joined her. He laid a hand on Bruno's head. We always thought no one cared, Luis said, that no one would believe us. They didn't believe us either, Remy said, his voice cracked but steady. That's why we have to believe each other. Silas stepped forward. This town has been under Creed's shadow too long. We're not asking you to pick up pitchforks or fight as guards, but if you speak together, the law outside this county will have to listen. And if they don't, someone shouted. Nora raised her hand. Then I go to the press, to the medical board. I can get this in front of federal eyes. And if they bury it, we keep going until someone can't ignore it anymore. It wasn't a rallying cry. It wasn't a revolution. But it was a start. A flicker of rebellion in the hearts of those long dulled by dust and silence. Near the doorway, a hunched man in a tattered denim jacket shuffled forward. His name was Benito Reyes, a former groundskeeper from Creed's estate, fired for speaking up about a missing worker 2 years prior. He had scars down one arm and cloudy vision in one eye. I still have keys to the south lot, he said quietly, and I remember where they kept the records. Silas nodded slowly. Then, we've got a way in. The room buzzed with cautious energy, a current of fear battling with something even more dangerous. Hope. Boone leaned back, whispering to Milo, "You feel that?" "What?" "The desert. It's listening." The wind changed that morning. It wasn't just the temperature, though the desert air had grown cooler overnight. It wasn't just the clouds gathering over the buttes like ghostly sentinels. No, it was something else. A shift in weight, in silence. The kind of stillness that settles before a storm, before justice or ruin, depending on the choices made. Silas Grady stood near the barn fence at Cactus Hollow, a cup of black coffee cradled in his weathered hands. His lean frame, wrapped in a dark flannel and jeans, blended into the wooden posts like he'd always belonged. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, not for cattle this time, but for trucks. Behind him, Boone Keller walked slowly across the yard, still favoring his ribs. Remy Chase helped Nora unload a crate of medical supplies. Milo sat on the steps, scribbling into a fresh notebook. This time not a ledger of corruption, but a journal of names they'd saved and those they still hoped to. Bruno lay beneath the porch shade, one ear twitching at every gust of wind. His scars caught the morning light, and his eyes followed everything. A sentry with no leash, no command, but endless resolve. Then came the sound. A low growl rumbled from Bruno's chest before the engines were even visible. 2 black trucks tore up the desert road, dust flying behind them like a dragon's tail. Boone's hand went to the old revolver holstered at his hip, a remnant from a different war. Silas didn't move. He sipped his coffee once, then set it down slow. From the lead truck stepped Cal Rutger, a thug in his 40s with a buzz cut, oversized belt buckle, and shoulders like a rusted gate. His nose had been broken more times than he could count, and his hands, tattooed and thick-fingered, rested too comfortably near the shotgun slung over his back. 3 other men followed, younger, cockier, all dressed in dark clothes that looked tactical but smelled like fear. Cal shouted, "We're here for the traitors. Creed wants his property back." Boone stepped forward. "We're not property, and Creed's going to want a lawyer more than muscle by the time today's done." Cal laughed. "Ain't no lawyer gonna save you from what's coming?" Nora emerged then, cool as glass, holding up her phone. "Funny you should say that. You're already live," she said. "And not just on a feed. There's a U.S. Marshal a mile behind you. You've got about 30 seconds to explain why you brought unregistered weapons onto private land." Behind her, Marshal Renner, a tall, dark-skinned man in a tan jacket, stepped into view with 2 federal agents behind him. He had a no-nonsense gait and a voice like gravel under boot heels. "That's long enough." Cal turned, too slowly, and found himself facing 3 drawn pistols. His shotgun clattered to the ground. "Drop your weapons," Renner said. "You're under federal custody for threatening a protected witness and obstruction of justice." One by one, the men complied. Cuffs clicked like punctuation in the desert air. Boone muttered, "Didn't think it'd be that easy." Renner smiled slightly. "You're lucky Nora Grady called a contact in Phoenix. Federal jurisdiction trumps everything around here, even Creed's money." An hour later, as the goons were hauled away, another team moved on Waylon Creed's ranch. A SWAT truck parked at his gate, agents raiding the back barn where Milo said he'd seen Karen last. They found more than they expected. Locked ledgers, illegal chemicals, blackmail notes, and a camera cache that linked Creed to 6 criminal enterprises. Waylon himself was found in his office, cigar still burning, frozen in place when he saw the warrant. "You boys made a mistake," he hissed at Boone as he passed in handcuffs. Boone didn't flinch. "So did you?" The sun rose higher as the ranch was sealed off, the fences marked by crime scene tape. By noon, news trucks were rolling in from Tucson and Flagstaff. The reckoning had arrived, not with fire and blood, but with names, facts, and the will to fight back. Back at Cactus Hollow, the mood shifted from tension to something else, quiet celebration. Inside the barn, Bruno barked at a rabbit and then chased it halfway across the field before returning to Boone's side, tail wagging. Nora knelt beside him with a red bandana and tied it gently around his neck. "There," she said. "Now you're official." Boone smiled and patted Bruno's side. "You're staying, you know. This place could use a good dog." Bruno leaned into the touch. Silas stood nearby, tipping his hat. "We'll build him a proper shelter." Remy stretched his arms and looked toward the hills. "Feels strange." "What does?" Milo asked. "This. Being safe. Having people who care." Boone looked at both men and then toward the porch, where Nora and Bruno sat. "No one gets left behind," he said. "Not this time. Not even a dog." That night, the stars over Sable Rock burned clearer than they had in months. The desert, long silenced by fear, echoed faintly with the laughter of men who had nearly died, and the gentle patting of a scarred dog who chose not to give up. Sometimes, God sends his miracles not with thunder or lightning, but with paw prints in the dust and a quiet heart that refuses to give up. Bruno was once discarded, broken, and forgotten, but through him, lives were saved, truths were revealed, and hardened hearts found their way home. This story reminds us that redemption is always possible. No soul is ever too lost. Whether you're a scarred dog, a weary soldier, or a simple ranch hand, God has a way of placing us exactly where we're needed, even if the road there is covered in heat, dust, and silence. If you've ever felt overlooked, left behind, or broken, remember, God sees you. He works through the quiet moments, the brave hearts, and even the wounded ones. And sometimes, the greatest heroes don't speak, they simply stay. If this story moved your heart, type Amen in the comments to bless others who need hope. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they are not forgotten. Let us know in the comments which part of the story touched you most. Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and divine grace. May God bless you and keep you safe, always.